Good morning. I'm Rob VanWynsberghe of Adult Learning and Education program in the Department of Educational Studies. I'd like to welcome you to our roundtable entitled Cities as Sites for Transformative Change: How and Why Universities Can Contribute. This roundtable has been made possible by the generosity of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education. The co-directors are Drs. Handel Wright and Andre Mazawi, and their formidable efforts in CCIE translate into an intellectually challenging and publicly engaged platform for addressing anti-Black racism in Canada. I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate Dr. Wright for becoming the Senior Advisor to President Ono on anti-racism and inclusive education. Great job, Dr. Wright. It's an excellent position for you to have at the university, and I know you'll make a great contribution. To start, I'd like to ask our co-researcher and current graduate student, Kyla Pascal, to introduce herself and offer this gathering a land acknowledgement that she has created for the research project we all belong to. Kyla?
Thank you. I myself am a Métis woman, born and raised in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, colonially known as Edmonton, on Treaty 6 territory. But I'm here in so-called Vancouver as an uninvited guest on the traditional homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We would like to acknowledge that the University of British Columbia is situated on stolen, unceded Musqueam territory, and we recognize both the historical and ongoing violence that settler colonialism has and continues to perpetuate in this place. We would also like to recognize that the work with this project extends beyond the Coast Salish territories across Indigenous lands throughout so-called Canada. I would like to close with some words from the Feminist Media Studio that invites us to acknowledge that while Zoom is the technical custodian of the platform on which we gather, this makes us no less occupants of the multiple territories on which we are all physically located, and to remember that Zoom is a platform which connects us and which alienates us from the aims of restitution, justice, and reparation.
Thank you, Kyla. All of us are working together on a SSHRC-funded project entitled Transforming City Governments in Response to Disruptive Change, Meeting the Challenges of Colonization, Inequity, and Climate Change. If I was to offer a second subtitle, I would suggest we're engaged in a national experiment on public service innovation. The project seeks to understand and aid in the efforts of Canadian cities to address the complex challenges of decolonization, inequity, and climate change. Our research goals include to enable personal, organizational, and systems transformation in local governments on the complex challenges of decolonization, inequity, and climate change. Second, to build innovation, infrastructure, and local governments to effectively respond to new challenges as they emerge. Goal 3, to reimagine what local governments might need to be in these challenging and changing times. And 4, and perhaps the one most applicable to today, to explore the roles and responsibilities of academia in this work. In this project, we are experimenting with the conditions for city officials to lead transformative change by creating a national public service innovation lab. A cohort of 15 to 20 city staff will form a community of practice in teams of 4. The curriculum will subvert the siloed organizational structures that separate disciplines, approaches, and roles in problematic ways, mirroring, I would suggest, the same challenges that we have in academia. We are taking an interdisciplinary approach to this project. We are going to integrate our team's experiences. We are going to elicit the expertise of many, and we're going to draw on the interests from other academic disciplines, deepening connections to practice. And we commit to being informed by knowledge systems that we determine are critical to our city partners' challenges. In order to increase the readiness of city staff related to decolonization, climate change, and inequity, we have two major assumptions in this project. We need to rehearse the new, to create experiences that close the gaps between what is happening now and what is possible and needed. Second major assumption is that public service innovation does not currently have a strong practice in understanding, engaging, and transforming power structures and systems, meaning that politics and positional power are proxies for leadership based on position rather than leadership based on other roles, orientations, activities, and positions. We have three major questions. Does the local government have the right enabling conditions for innovation at this time? And if so, what are they? Is there a strategic approach to building innovation infrastructure? What does leadership for public service innovation look like? What practices does it embody, and where does it reside? Theoretically, we're drawing upon 3 case studies. These could be considered pilot research that we're doing. We're also drawing on a number of literatures, including governance, public management, social innovation, leadership, transformative learning, collaboration, systems thinking, sustainability, scaling, and diffusion. We're interested in the topic of transformation within and across the individual, the organizational, and the system. We're going to practice a bricolage approach, which means at this time a combination of constructivist grounded theory and participatory action research. Our methods will include interviews, observations, surveys, reflections, and constant comparisons across the different sites for our research. The competencies that we hope to build in the group that gets involved with us are along the lines of social innovation, systems thinking, strategic design, decolonization, equity, inclusion, and developmental evaluation. Now we are going to hear from Doctors Mumbi Maina and Maggie, whose very presence embodies some of the key questions that we outlined in our abstract, namely, what histories have shaped our institutions? What processes have led to the erasure of ethnocultural groups such as Black communities? How can we decolonize our practices? What collaborations are needed for shared decision-making? Finally, what are the enabling conditions for transformative change? And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mumbi Maina.
Thank you, Rob, so much for that introduction, and to Kyla for acknowledging places and where we're at. I also just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the homelands of the Hankaminam and the Squamish speaking peoples here in Burnaby. And I here as a newcomer and as an uninvited guest here, I really connect to the peoples and the lands of these territories, because I myself, I'm an indigenous person from Kenya, and I am from the Kikuyu tribe of Kenya, which is the largest tribe of the 45 tribes that we have in Kenya. And you know, unfortunately, I did not always, you know, value or relate closely with my indigeneity until I left home and until I left my home country. And I was, you know, born and raised in Kenya, and I went through the British education system. Surprise, surprise. So Kenya was colonized by the British. But so, you know, the education system from K through 12 and all the way to higher education was the British system. So we, in my literature class, we studied literature Beowulf, in literature of England, so Canterbury Tales, Beowulf, and those very English stories, and very, you know, sprinkling here and there of our own writers, but really not being embedded and immersed in those cultures. It's not until I left my home country and came to North America in central Minnesota, where I really started to think about who am I really, and to be confronted with questions of my race and my identity and where I was from and what, how do we live there, and so immediately coming to North America for my studies, I was just immersed into that culture of race and identity politics, and I quickly had to learn how to identify myself and check the box, so to speak, even though there was no place for checking, African, I checked as Black. And so, and I just found very quickly how our identities really influence and influence how we move around the world, how we experience our cities, and how we even experience our higher education institutions. And I found myself there planning and organizing with grassroots community organizations, particularly those really focusing on issues of immigrant women and higher education, and really looking at how to build solidarities across Indigenous African American women and newcomers, women from African, Latinas, and really understanding how we can create communities together. But and looking back now, I realized that we were creating community, we were building solidarities, we were collaborating, but these were happening outside the formal structures of city government, the city of St. Cloud at that time. And I consider myself as building cities, right? Because those are the divisions that we were kind of taught to see and to separate that work. And it's until my my doctoral program that I began to explore questions of who is involved in various initiatives in higher education and in terms of sustainability, and specifically the role of different actors and how different actors are involved in sustainability, and really thinking about how historically marginalized groups can be and to the extent to which they are engaged in these conversations of sustainability. And I think what I started to see there in that research is that the role of external actors such as cities and municipal government and policies coming from provincial governments, and how those influence the policies that get taken up in higher education. And my curiosity there was, if this is the influences that we're seeing, who is really being impacted by these policies within higher education? Who is involved in driving them? And I saw the power of faculty members to involve their students in various courses that were embedded in the community. And I also saw the power of student organizations in being able to be engaged in extracurricular activities to influence what's happening in their cities, so to build their communities and also contribute to higher education initiatives. Unfortunately, in the Lower Mainland, for example, I think we were talking the other day and Rob was saying there is 21 municipal governments in Lower Mainland. But when you think about UBC, for example, where we were looking at our research there, the students were telling us, for example, if they live in Langley or Surrey, then they're not able to be involved in initiatives that are happening at UBC or in Vancouver proper, because they cannot afford to live in Vancouver or at UBC. So already there we are seeing a gap or a disconnect with students from lower economic classes, racialized students who travel and commute for long distance and sometimes have to take a second job and so have, do not have the opportunity to be involved. And so to me, these are patterns and opportunities that we started to see in my doctoral research, that I see as opportunities and as chances and places where there could be more collaborations across not just Vancouver proper, but across Lower Mainland more generally. And then in coming to my involvement with the city of Vancouver, I had not envisioned myself as being able to participate or be actively involved in government, because I did not see that as my place, and the education that I had did not draw those connections very clearly. And it's only until after I became the the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Fellow with Sustainability Group at the City of Vancouver that I began to see the possibilities and the importance of having these and introducing these conversations of equity, of diversity, of decolonization into city planning. And I continue to see that happening throughout the role that I have and throughout this research project that we're talking about, and really envisioning how we can bridge the gap, or we can bridge the practices that are happening at the city with academic pursuits at UBC and other institutions. So I maybe just want to stop there for now, and we can talk about that more as we go into the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mumbi. That was very interesting, and I think there's a lot you've raised. I'm going to ask Maggie to please speak for a few minutes as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mumbi, for that, and Kyla for the land acknowledgement, and Rob for introducing us. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'm joining from the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in my little office in Mount Pleasant. And as Rob mentioned, my name is Maggie Lowe, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Community and Regional Planning. And my position sits in a pretty unique and I would say fantastic program called the Indigenous Community Planning Master's Program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. So a little bit about me. I'm of mixed ancestry. I'm Italian, French, and English from my mom's side, and from my dad's side, English, French, and I'm a member of Wikwemikong unceded territory on Manitoulin Island in Northern Ontario. And I did not grow up with a connection to Wikwemikong. I was born and raised in Sudbury, which is a Northern Ontario city. It's called the hub of the North, if you're from Ontario. I was very, very lucky to grow up in a middle-class family with white privilege. And I've been on my own journey of figuring out what my Indigenous identity means. And a lot of that has come through the work that I've done as a researcher, as a scholar, and some of the work that I've done for an Indigenous run nonprofit. And so overall, with this kind of identity and this curiosity, I feel like I have a responsibility and a passion towards supporting Indigenous folks, whether that's organizations, communities, governments, in achieving whatever goals that they wish to achieve. So growing up, I loved the outdoors. I loved, I was a summer camp kid. I loved fishing with my dad, and that eventually led me to an undergraduate degree in environmental science at the University of Guelph. And with the help of a few encouraging professors, I pursued a master's degree at the University of Victoria in environmental studies. And at that time, I was really interested in environmentalism and the environmental movement, and how environmentalism was going to save us from the impacts of climate change and save the planet. And I examined this going into my master's research. I was examining the negotiation of a set of large-scale land use agreements between environmentalists, the forest industry, First Nations governments, and the BC government in an area called the Great Bear Rainforest, which is in BC, which is basically the north and central coast of what is now known as British Columbia. But as that research unfolded, it quickly became apparent that it was really Indigenous governments in that region that was really driving a lot of change, both for themselves and really pushing the BC government and forest companies and environmentalists to think and act differently. And so my interest in Indigenous governments really grew in that work. And I came to realize that what was happening in that region, like I said, was really driven by Indigenous nations, First Nations governments really asserting and exercising their inherent jurisdictional authority. And so I really wanted to dig into this further, and I wanted to know more about how First Nations in that coastal region were doing this work and what the impact was were there for their communities. And I was lucky enough to start pursuing a PhD at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability here at UBC. And through that work, I was able to develop a relationship with the wonderful folks in Bella Bella, BC, which is the main community of the Celtic Nation. And to begin my research and kind of try to understand these broader kind of governance plays that were happening kind of at the higher level. So between First Nations governments, it was called government to government negotiations. So government negotiations between, negotiations between the First Nations government and the province. I really wanted to ensure that that was my broad interest, and I wanted to make sure that the questions that I was looking at in my PhD work were driven by community, because that's what needed to happen. It couldn't be somebody that didn't know the landscape very well to come in and kind of establish research questions. So I asked the Celtic Integrated Resource Management Department if they had specific questions for me to look at in my PhD work, and they came back to me and said, yes, we do. We'd like you to look at to investigate the successes and failures of another set of political negotiations and agreements that were being negotiated with the federal and provincial government at the time. And so I won't go into the details of that, but I did just that. And so through that work, I was able to, I moved to Bella Bella for about 1.5 years to conduct more ethnographic work and to get to know the place and the people that I effectively was studying. But of course, this experience was much more than that. You know, I developed relationships. I worked part-time for the band, and for the first time in my life, admittedly, I was part of the visible minority and an outsider in a very tight-knit community, and there was a constant feeling of feeling uncomfortable, but a good uncomfortable, and it taught me a lot. And so my research with Celtic Nation found that the Celtic are asserting their sovereignty and their jurisdictional authority in ways that the Canadian government can't ignore, and in ways that aren't just brought to the courts now, that ways that are negotiated into agreements and to political agreements. And so this has really driven my work. So I'm really motivated by the question of what are the strategic acts happening outside the courts that are moving Indigenous sovereignty forward. And I've been lucky to pursue parts of this question at SCARP through the work I do with students at the in the Indigenous Community Planning Program. So quickly, I'll just mention though, what does this have to do with cities and this project that we're embarking on together? And so as I was nearing the end of my PhD work, I moved back to Vancouver and to write my dissertation. And of course, like many PhD students at the end of their degree, they need money and they need a job. So I was lucky to get on as a Green City scholar and was hired by Lindsay Cole, who's the other member of our research group. And she's actually off writing her dissertation right now, her own dissertation. And so she hired me to help her. She's a city planner at the City of Vancouver, to help her with the first iteration of the City of Vancouver Solutions Lab. And so the Solutions Lab at that time was, and it still is today, kind of a microcosm of the work that we're doing here in this project to understand how Canadian cities can transform as they address the complex challenges of decolonization, equity, and climate change. And so in this 4-month position, working with Lindsay, I became fascinated by how change happens not only at the kind of higher governance level between First Nations governments and Canadian governments, like what I was witnessing in Bella Bella, but I also became interested in how those negotiations and changes are happening in cities and in communities. And at the time, one little quick story that really was another turning moment, or kind of a big moment for me after living in Bella Bella, was part of this work. I was supporting Lindsay in delivering facilitated kind of labs where city staff and community partners would book time out of their own work day to learn together and to understand the complex problems they were facing kind of differently and work together to prototype solutions. And so one of the sessions that we had organized was with a great group of folks from the arts and culture departments in the city and their kind of the community organizations that we work with. And we were all sitting together in this room, and we had just finished an activity doing a debrief about, you know, how do we collectively understand the problem of the lab. I can't totally remember the wording of the problem. And a group member looked around, we were all doing this, looked around, and she said, why is this a room full of white people? Where are the other voices in this room? And that was such an important moment for me, and it really stuck out. And I you know, realized that even though, you know, there's such good intention behind these labs, and there still is, that I needed to understand better why there wasn't a diversity in that room. And it really helped me kind of push me in the work that I'm doing and moving forward. So I won't go, maybe I'll stop there, just to say, and just say that, you know, I've been lucky enough after this work with the Solutions Lab, and for a short time I worked for an Indigenous run nonprofit, and I really loved that work because it would allow me to kind of do community-based work, which is what the type of work that I love to do. But I really felt like I wasn't able to really think about the ideas that were needed to transform the work that we need to do. I was kind of like, all I could do is think about like what I needed to do that day. And so I was lucky enough to apply for a position that came up at the School of Community Regional Planning in the ICP program, Indigenous Community Planning. And that's where I am today. I applied for it and I somehow got it, and I've been at it for the last year and a half. And it's allowed me to look at all of these questions, look at what's going on in cities, continue my community-based work through and with my students, which I feel unbelievably lucky to be able to do. And just at the beginning of my position, Lindsay got in touch again, and she said, let's write this grant proposal, meet my colleague Rob VanWynsberghe, and we'll write this proposal, and we're going to get more money to delve deeper into the change that is needed. And it worked. We were successful in that grant, and we've assembled such a beautiful and diverse and intersectional team that you see on your screen. And there's two other members, Lindsay and now Lindsay Cole and Lily Raphael, who couldn't join us today. But here we are, and I can speak for myself that I'm very excited to see how this research unfolds with this team. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie. I was wondering if we could maybe ask Mumbi if you'd like to add anything, given what you've just heard Maggie say, sort of a continuation of what you offered, but maybe a few thoughts that perhaps link a little bit about the two talks.
Yeah, thanks Rob, and thanks Maggie for those thoughts. It's clear to see the path that you've kind of taken, and really how that journey has also like helped you continue to be grounded in your own indigeneity and the questions that you're asking. You know, I think similar to you, since embarking on doing environmental work and being involved in grassroots environmental organizing, moving into my doctoral work, you know, I often found myself as one of the onlys when I went to conferences, sustainability conferences, environmental education conferences, and even the research project that I was involved in, I was often the onlys, and just thinking about reflecting on how sometimes I have to show up in these white spaces, and how that it creates very interesting dynamics, and in the way the things I'm able to say, how I'm able to show up, influences actually the quality of what I'm able to contribute. And when I think about when I go back into my communities that I'm embedded in, how I'm just like, I feel, okay, I don't have to like put up a facade, it's not a facade, but I don't have to show up in a certain way. I can just show up as me with my full, my Kenyan identity and just who I am. And I think that this feeling is kind of connected to the question that was raised at the lab there about why is it only, you know, where are the other voices on the table? And, you know, as we think about cities and in Vancouver, you know, and I'm sure this is replicated across other cities as well. These are structures that are built from Western dominant perspectives, and so the cultures that drive the work there, the practices, the processes, you know, what's valued as knowledge, the professionalism that we have to show up to work with, the questions that we ask, you know, all these are shaped by these Western dominant cultures. And so for me, coming into the city and being immersed in this work where I am tasked with developing or supporting the development of the equity framework at the City of Vancouver, it's been really central for us to think about what approaches can we use that can help us to get to the root causes and to unearth some of these dominant perspectives that have become so normalized that we do not see, they don't get questioned, right? And so in that work, we have been talking about equity as not treating everybody equal, you know, and not seeing difference, but you know, equality, like moving away from equality and moving into equity, where we recognize where everybody is positioned and recognizing that given this positionality, people walk in the world differently, people experience the city differently. And so because of that positioning, we have to consider what does this population and what does this community need to be able to thrive and prosper in Vancouver. And so we have been talking about decolonization, we've been talking about racial justice, we have been talking about intersectionality, and how these approaches really can help us to understand how we start to address some of the systemic inequities that we have seen at the City of Vancouver. And I think for me, this is really rooted in the work that I did in my doctoral program as well, because I realized when you talk about sustainability, when we talk about environmental issues, oftentimes they are separated. We separate environmental issues from social issues. And so how can we look at both the social and the environmental part together to be able to understand that without social justice, without equity, we cannot address the problem of sustainability. So sustainability, for us to build resilient and sustainable communities, we have to address poverty in our communities. We have to address issues of racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. We have to look at how people in the queer community, for example, experience the city. When we walk, when we talk about safety, what is that? Who feels safe at the city? You know, so the questions that we're asking is who benefits from the program, the policies, the practices that we have, and why do they benefit, and who is left out from the policies and programs that we develop, and what are some of the unintended consequences of these policies. And so I think those are really some of the core, those questions are at the center of the work that we're doing with the project to really help us to start at the individual level to question what are the histories that we have been socializing into, what stories have our families told us about how our communities, our families got to Canada, right? Did they, did they just come with nothing and just start from the, scratch and pull themselves at the bootstrap, the dominant narrative? And that's how they succeeded. And what are the stories that are not being told about the Indigenous peoples who are here, that these were not empty lands, right? So how can we unearth and bring to light those assumptions, those hidden stories, disrupt and unsettle those dominant stories and narratives, and be able to really consciously bring to the foreground the norms, the values, the attitude, the assumptions that we each bring as we plan and as we talk about how our cities are going to thrive and to be sustainable. So these really are at the core of the work that we're doing with this project. And, just also to thank Lindsay, because she's the one that brought us together and has really labored over some of these questions for a long time. So I think it's an honor to be part of this group that continues to think about how we can bring other city staff across Canada to think about these questions and in contributing to transformative change that we want to see in our communities.
Thank you, Mumbi. I'm going to let the two speakers take a breath. And I think one of the dominant themes is graduate students. You talked about your experiences as graduate students, and we're so lucky to have a graduate student with us. And I thought we might ask Kyla what kinds of things she might learn in having heard your stories and having worked with you in this research environment. So you represent the cutting edge of research at UBC and elsewhere, and Kyla has time with you, and she has her own research agenda. So perhaps, Kyla, you could comment a little bit on what you learn in listening to these learning journeys from Maggie and from Mumbi, and then we'll open it up to all three of you after this. Kyla?
Sure. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you too. It was great to hear your stories a little bit more than I have already. The reason that I at first was interested in this project, my background is a lot more small scale grassroots organizing. So I was interested in, one, being new or like back in academia and in that kind of institution, and then thinking through cities and their place in change making as being a site that I do feel can be transformative and support kind of the change and the movement work that I'm interested in doing. And hearing these all that Mumbi and Maggie had to share was very enlightening. I feel like I have asked these questions myself. A lot of the things of who is in the room, like where are these voices that we're missing? Why are they not here? Who benefits from these decisions that we are making in this room, and why? And whose stories aren't being told is kind of a foundation of the work that I am interested in doing, and also the disrupting and unsettling of these institutions. So I think this presents itself as a very interesting project in doing the work and having a wonderful learning journey that we can take across Canada is so interesting, because as a person who's from Edmonton, and learning about the city of Vancouver through school so far, I've learned is very different, just in the differences of what, cities are taking on, what their focus is so extremely different, that I'm really excited about how we can take this conversation nationally. And at the same time, I think we're going to hear similar yet different conversations. Everybody's going to be asking those questions of like who's in the room and why. So I'm really excited about having this opportunity to dive a bit deeper into all of this great content.
Thank you very much, Kyla. So that means that we have three folks in the circle now who have talked a little bit about disrupting the typical trajectory of dialogue around the future of our cities. And I'd like to begin by asking what might be a somewhat harder question. If this work and you represent an effort to decolonize either a city or a university, where would you like to see changes coming out of this work? What would you like to see coming out of our research and your involvement? How would you like cities to perhaps begin to look the way that we've talked about them looking? And Kyla, please go ahead. Yes.
Sure. I think I've been thinking a lot about the expert. So I would really love to see conversations and a bit of changing of the guard in terms of who the expert is. I think in institutions, they are built on these foundations of kind of white supremacy and colonialism that lends itself well to who has the right information and the most of it in kind of a strange way. So I'd really be interested in having those conversations about community and where the community expert comes in, both in the university learning journey and in the cities as well.
Thank you, Kyla. Mumbi or Maggie, would you like to offer your thoughts on that question?
I can kind of build on that. I think from maybe the academic perspective or the academy perspectives, what I know. And I think I really like, Kyla, how you bring up the definition of what an expert is. And I think trying to encourage our graduate students, but also our current faculty in really thinking about the definition of an expert and how that plays out in the work, the research that is done, the authors that are put on papers, and I'm thinking of specifically, just how we think about, this might be low-hanging fruit. UBC is already working on this, but the PhD programs and how we can, and there is work through the Public Scholars Initiative to reimagine what is inherently valuable in a PhD program. And the PSI actually is setting out to reimagine PhD pathways that actually legitimize broader concepts of scholarship. So actually, legitimizing the community expert and making that core to the work that's being done and even the dissertation. So seeing, support for those types of initiatives, those types of initiatives being elevated in the university from all levels, I think would be something really powerful to see.
Thank you, Maggie. Mumbi?
Yeah, I think I see a thread and also linked to kind of what I'm thinking about, and also what my research showed is the need for collaboration and collaboration in the true sense of the word. I think collaboration is has been thrown out there, so it's been so mainstream that I feel like it's lost its meaning a little bit. But if we go back to the core, the root of that word, really thinking about how can we co-produce, and I think this is really linked to who you see yourself collaborating. The ability to collaborate with someone, you have to see them as an expert, or at least somebody who is adding value toward the initiatives that you're tackling. And so for me, I think what I would like to see is really people, both city staff and community members and higher education institutions, really forging respectful collaboration processes where they see the community as knowledge holders and as people who know exactly what they want and how they want it done, and I think sometimes the challenge with city staff or planning sometimes is that we assume what's good for communities, and then on the other end in academia, in research, we over-research marginalized communities and low-income communities. We over-research them, and the relationship is a dominant relationship such that we go there with our own assumptions and put our own lenses to the research projects, and just we zip in and out, and we leave the communities just hanging. And I think there's a lot of research I think of Linda Tuay Smith, whose work has, talked about decolonizing methodologies and the impact, the negative impact on Indigenous communities with researchers, and how those processes can be harmful. So when I think about collaborations really between city staff, in communities themselves, and higher education institutions, I think there's opportunities there to think about how we can, the three entities can be collaborators in the true sense of the word, where knowledge is valued equally, where community participants are seen as true experts of their own lived experiences, because they're the ones who live these lives and they understand exactly what they need. So for me, I think, and when we immerse academics and students in communities, then we start to see the power of communities to really organize and know what's best for them. And I think to what Maggie is saying, I think academia, the outputs of a faculty member, for example, in terms of like researching and publishing, doesn't always align with the goals of communities. So how can we transform our education institutions and the processes of tenure such that the work that faculty do with community members is valued as equally, or if not more than the publications, for example. Or if publications are needed, then they are collaboratively, done with the community members such that they benefit the communities within which this work is happening. So for me, in many words, collaboration is what comes to mind. And also just looking beyond one's own discipline, because the challenges of today really cannot afford to continue to be conceptualized and solved within single siloed disciplines. So we need interdisciplinary collaborations, transdisciplinary collaborations, to be able to build strong teams that are really well equipped to deal with the challenges of the 21st century. So for me, I think that would be the one thing that I'd want to see happen out of this.
Thank you, Mumbi. That's fascinating, and it leads me to ask a question that I've always wanted to ask, but I've never asked, which is, what question would you like me to ask at this point? I think it's an interesting way, a different way of preparing research questions, to go to a community and say, what are your research questions, as opposed to saying, here's mine. So in that spirit, what research questions do you wish I would ask you? And this may be our final question, so we'll have to think about this a little bit. But would anyone like to pose a question that they would like me to pose to them? I can pitch one. What research method is one that you're most excited about when you think about a collaboration that involves a UBC, a city of Vancouver, and a community? What are the ways of collecting information that you suspect we need to use to make sure we are equitable, that we're respectful, that we're sharing and asking and disseminating? And this is a real issue for us, isn't it, as a research project? And we're going to need to talk about this. But even as you think about it, is there anything that comes to mind that might be a way? So that would be one question that I think I might have. But you might have a better question for yourself, and that's fair too.
I think that's a good question, Rob, especially because I know it's at the core of what institutions do, and even cities, even though it's not named, we do have processes that we use and methods and methodologies. Recently I've been really I've been informed by Julian Ageman's work from Tufts University and his work on just sustainabilities. And, you know, for me, he's been recently talking about, and many other people talk about narratives and storytelling as ways of really gathering information in a way that that's not restrictive, that just gives autonomy to participants, to researchers, and kind of blurs those lines, and has the potential to give us such a wealth of knowledge and resources, and is situated, like we tell stories all the time. The way we talk to our family members, to our friends, is through stories and narratives. But then when we transform into other spaces, we have PowerPoint presentations and different ways of doing things that don't come natural to us. So narratives and storytelling, I see that as one way that we can do this work within this project, and more broadly too, in these creative ways of even preserving and sharing stories across the world, through podcasts, through enacting different scenarios and things like that. So I think for me, that's how I would think about that question. And that's a good question, I like it.
Thank you, thank you. Would you like me to ask you the same question, Kyla or Maggie, or would you like a different question?
Well, I was just going to say, I also really like that question. And I echo what Mumbi said about narratives and storytelling, and how that really does come much more naturally to us than, crafting beautiful PowerPoint slides or keynote slides, as I spent most of my weekend doing. And so I think there's a lot of value in that. I was just reminded when you were saying that of some of the, Indigenous research methodologies that really, we should be looking to those knowledge holders, those authors, those scholars. And you had Mumbi just earlier mentioned decolonizing methodologies, and there's just such rich, grounded work that Indigenous scholars do. I'm thinking of Leanne Simpson's work in her latest book, As We Have Always Done. I think we need to start there, at least within our own project, or it's a way we could start. And then also thinking about the Indigenous community planning and the comprehensive community planning process, and thinking about how key to that process. So this is the type of planning that a lot of Indigenous communities do for their own community. Engagement and hearing from community members is central to that process. And so how can we take that idea and use it in our learning journey? But of course, getting back to some of Mumbi's points, this type of research methodology, it takes a long time, as it should, and it's not well recognized within, it's not valued as it should be, I think, in the academy, and higher institutions of learning. So I think Mumbi, you really raised a really good point around, what does tenure look like, and why, what are the outcomes that we need to, just to put in a plug for that, we need to be rethinking those structures as well to actually enable this type of research to happen.
Thank you, Maggie. Kyla, would you like this question, or would you like a different question?
I'm not sure if I have more to add. I think the storytelling and the decolonizing of methodologies is extremely important and valuable to the work we do. I guess a research question, and that Maggie was just kind of speaking to, of outcomes, and something that we've talked about is what does success for this project look like? And I'm thinking a lot of the implementation of the work that comes out of the learning journey as we take it on. I think cities and universities and lots of like kind of higher institutions love doing committees and thinking on these things, but when do we implement, and what does that look like? And obviously we're kind of just starting on the journey with folks to kind of ask these questions, but what does this look like in the long run is a question that I'm very curious about and am excited to see where it goes.
Thank you very much, Kyla. That success question is, yeah, it's a fascinating one. And I remember the first time that you raised it, I think, in one of our meetings. Yeah, it really resonates. So I think we have enough time to ask one fairly quick question. And that is perhaps along the lines of the competencies or capacities that we talk about in our project. But I wondered if you could quickly offer up a competency that you think is necessary for us to be involved in this kind of work, a kind of skill or attitude or predisposition that we as a research group need to take on in order to do a really good job of this kind of work. I guess one example would be a systems thinker. You know, do we need to be a systems thinker in order to hold up all of these different systems that are interacting with one another that have to be seriously reevaluated if we're going to achieve equity or move towards reconciliation, those kinds of things. So what competencies or capacities do you feel like we need to cultivate within our group in order to be successful? And hopefully someone wants to be the first to answer that.
I can take a go at that. And I think Mumbi, you and I had a great conversation about capacities and competencies a few weeks ago. And there's, yeah, I think for us as a group, and I think we do this, and so you know, to continue to do it, but I really like this idea of thinking about things relationally and, you know, relational practice, and everything and everybody is connected. And what I mean by that too is you can ground it in this kind of concept that comes, that Jessie Hemphill talks about. She's an adjunct professor in SCARP and the instructor of our practicum, is this idea of nested systems. So what's happening at the micro level, so individually day to day in our lives, is most likely translating into the macro level. And so if I'm feeling overwhelmed and, you know, exhausted by something, the chances are other people are feeling that way. If I'm feeling joyful or, you know, like things are going okay, I have a handle on things, chances are that there are other people that feel that way as well. Maybe not everybody, but that's the general idea. And I see that playing out in our team really nicely. And I would love to see that, you know, translated and into the learning journey that we facilitate and curate for a really cool group of folks.
Thank you. That's a great answer, Maggie. Kyla, Mumbi, would you like to quickly?
Yeah, I can quick answer. I'm interested in thinking about or developing the skill of like kind of making the space for uncomfortability. I think where a lot of projects and research and the work goes wrong is where we're scared to have those really uncomfortable conversations. I'm sure in Maggie's example, it was very uncomfortable for that one person to ask in this room of like, why are there only white people here? Is a really uncomfortable conversation to have, and create like a container of love and good intentions behind it. But just being okay and setting up this learning journey to have these uncomfortable conversations, because I think that's really where we do the growing and where that transformative change happens.
Thank you very much, Kyla. That was great. Mumbi, do you want to offer your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've been so together for a while that we're just kind of thinking along the same lines here. I think connected to that too, I've been thinking about cultural humility and openness, because within that discomfort that Kyla is talking about, there is really need to, when you're invited to think about a different possibility, it really takes an individual who is open to being challenged, to being invited to lean in, to being invited to think differently. So I think just having that cultural humility to be able to, and an open mind to be able to step into this space that we are creating, and be challenged in that discomfort and be okay with that. I think to me that's a competence that would be much needed, because we don't really, we might have some glimpses of what we might want for the future, but we don't really know what that looks like. So also having that that vision and that imagine the possibilities of the futures that we want. And I think that's really grounded in being able to let go of what we have learned, what we've been socialized to step into, and just having an open heart and open mind, the cliche language, to be able to imagine a different future. So for me, that I think comes with a lot of humility, a lot of love. This work can be joyful, like Maggie said. So I think all of those are welcome competencies and ways of being that we want to nurture within the spaces that we are creating. So I think that would be my answer.
Well, thank you all for those responses. They're wonderful, and I can hardly wait to see what our kind of pedagogy looks like as a result of having those outcomes, right? So that would be wonderful to think about what we're going to create, which is our next, I think it's one of our next mini projects within the research project. We're out of time, and I think on behalf of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education, I want to thank you very much for presenting. And I also want to thank the Center on behalf of the research project, if that's okay, for the opportunity to actually speak and to think about our project and to improve ourselves through this opportunity. So thank you very much, and we'll see each other soon.
All right. Thank you, Rob, for facilitating.
Oh.